The monthly Pathwork Step topics and weekly meeting cycles are basically 4 weeks at a time. And that means that every 3 times a year, I have to insert a 5th week to catch up with the calendar months. In the past, I've done that by just extending the discussion into 5 weeks instead of 4, saying just keep on going. But that's a little bit lazy. So I've been experimenting recently with, for that 5th week, bringing in an extra concept that wasn't completely covered during the lecture or was tangential to the discussions or that came up during the month. Previously, I focused on the grain of truth, which is mentioned in several lectures, but there is no central lecture defining or explaining or extrapolating on the grain of truth. This month, we worked on Pathwork Lecture 10, which is a question and answer lecture on male and female incarnations. That wasn't the original point of the lecture. It was the result of the questions from the participants. It evolved into that discussion. Towards the end, the discussion ranged around the question of how we incarnate and what that means. And that triggered my interest in Pathwork Lecture 34. I am very fond of the Pathwork lecture called Process for Reincarnation, or Preparation for Reincarnation. However, I understand that this can be challenging to people who do not believe in reincarnation. I invite you, as I talk about this, or as you read about it, to simply change it from reincarnation to incarnation, to accept the process as a description of a process that may describe elements of becoming a human being and then going back into spirit, as most religious beliefs consider that there is more to life than our humanity, that when we die, there is more. So if you consider incarnation versus reincarnation, this lecture might be more palatable for you. So I inserted some of the concepts of the process or preparation for reincarnation because it had to do with why did you choose to be male or female? Now, in Pathwork Lecture 10, the discussion was that you're born one way or the other, or you're born as a hermaphrodite, which was one of the questions that came up during the meeting. And the guide says that's a hard life. It's not easy to not be so-called normal. It triggers people's reactions. It triggers all kinds of things. So that to be born different would be a choice made in spirit for a reason. There would be something in it. And the extension of that is why I decided to bring in Pathwork 34, Pathwork Lecture 34, for the 5th week meeting. So Pathwork Lecture 34. It starts off with a very interesting phrase, and that is, the guide says, I speak tonight about the process of birth and have received permission to do so from higher authority. This grabbed my interest immediately. Carolyn Tylov of the Pennsylvania Pathwork has a wonderful way of teaching how to read lectures. And she teaches that you should stop the minute something catches your interest. Stay there. That may be the whole purpose of the lecture for you. It may have the whole meaning for you of why you selected a particular reading. There's no reason to go on because somebody else found something else of interest. So that when I hit this do so from a higher authority, questions began sprouting out of my brain. I thought, what higher authority? How does that happen? What's the mechanism in spirit for getting permission? So the channeling of the guide, again, if you do not believe in channeling, don't worry about it. Consider that it's Ava's divine presence, or however you wish to imagine it. But the guide states that he is not Ava, he is different, and that he is more than one, it's a team, and that they have to get permission about what to say. And the reason I find this interesting is then he talks about spiritual law. Basically, what he's saying is everything has to fit within spiritual law. And one of the things about spiritual law is for a spirit to bring something in must be in the interest, the highest good of the people that he's talking to or the beings that he's communicating with. So that a spiritual being cannot just zoom in, give you information for fun to disrupt things and then dash out. There's a process involved. And that's what Pathwork Lecture 34 is about. It's about a process. So then he goes into spiritual law and how karmic and spiritual law govern the incarnatory process, whether it's singular or multiple. One of the things he talks about is that absolute truth is visible to all in spirit. This is a running theme in the first few dozen lectures. He gets away from it later on, but in the first few dozen lectures, there's a lot of talk about spirit and the construct of the universe. And the guide often says, you don't seem to understand. We don't get confused. We don't have a problem knowing what truth is. It's right there in front of us. Because thoughts and feelings that are abstract and energetic and subtle and hard to understand in human form have form in spirit. Now, over and over again in these lectures, the guide says, this is hard for me to explain to you. This is something that happens in spirit. It doesn't happen on the earth plane. So what we see is not what you see with your eyes. And the process of learning about the human energy system, about learning to trust your inner guidance, your intuition, is about finding some way of accessing these forms, of holding them more steadily, of making them real to you than just an abstract, fleeting thought. So to get back to this, that absolute truth is visible to all in spirit. And the guide makes a very practical description of this. He says, everything is out in the open in the spirit world. It cannot be that one opinion stands against another. Your deeds, thoughts, feelings, your reactions, and your attitudes create definite forms that are as substantial and visible as any material object to you now, or even more so, as two normal people would not argue that a round table in front of them is round or square. That is a matter of opinion, that this is a matter of opinion. By the same token, the forms are there in spirit and cannot be argued about. Now, with human beings, when you see a table, it could be a square table with so much roundedness on the corners that one person considers it oval, another person considers it round. There's a lively debate about this. The guide's just picking an example. So definitively, round or square, considering what the words mean, once you see it, there's really no argument about what it is. And that's how definitive the guide is saying that thoughts and feeling and truth is in the spirit. So that when you try to make a decision, you're not deceived. You're not questioning what might be true or what might be real or where your developmental level is. It's as if you're wearing medals on your chest saying, I've been here, I've done this, I'm at this level, and everybody can see it. There's no argument. So one of the exercises that I come up with out of the lectures, I try to take the lectures and say, and what would a good question be to exemplify this material, was if that was true on the planet, if that was true in human form, would that make life easier or harder? Now, I'm a movie fan, so a silly movie that exemplifies this is the movie The Invention of Lying, where the premise is nobody lies. Nobody assumes a lie, nobody tells lies. And then one person one day realizes they could lie and get away with it because nobody would challenge them. And they do, and it's the phrase hot knife through butter. It it destroys the system because the system has no defense. It has no rebound, no reaction, no response to a lie. It's the opposite of that in spirit. You can't lie in spirit. So you just have to deal with what is. Now, the reason I'm going into that is it makes the application of spiritual law relatively easier, I would imagine. If you're not arguing about it, you're just applying it. You're just noticing the application. So in the process of decision making, there's not that ambivalence that we have as human beings. It's just a matter of, well, where shall we work? We could work here or there. And if we're there, we're at this level. And if we're here, we're at this level. And you can make a decision as if you're stacking blocks on a desktop. So in the process of decision making for the incarnatory process, the guide says there's a schooling connected with this decision making and planning for the next life. It's not a matter of simply saying, and your next task is. It's a process, an involved process, even for immature spirits who are not going to make their final decisions, meaning they're not going to be the primary decision makers with higher authority permission. They may be relegated to having a team make decisions for them, but it is still a process. There's still an invitation to be involved, and there's a schooling involved in that process. So the phrase, everything is grist for the mill, everything is grist for development. You can learn through discussion with your team about what might or might not work, and there's no ambivalence about it, except your free will to agree or not. And at a later point in this lecture, the guide says, and it's never dictatorial. It's always explained why your desires may not be appropriate for a forthcoming incarnation. It's expressed with love. How else would it be expressed? In spirit. Then he goes into examples of the law of self-responsibility in terms of decision making, that there are consequences to the decisions that are made. Sometimes a spirit is allowed to make a decision that isn't a good idea so that they can see the consequences. The law of cause and effect. So that if I am unable to accept the consequences of what would happen if I tried to lean or bend against spiritual law, you cannot break it. But if I just tried to lean or bend against spiritual law, I might dispute the consequences of that. And so they might agree for a lifetime that included a certain activity that would create those consequences so that I could see them. And that's where, if you can imagine, the process of incarnation is a great big therapy session. It's a matter of being able to exercise your free will, see where it goes, and then in that loop, getting feedback before and getting feedback after about what something meant and what the consequences were to your belief system, to your actions. I also brought in some material from Patrick Lecture 216, which is the connection between the incarnatory process and the life task, because they mesh so well. And obviously 34 and 216, the guide went back to that topic. He did in other lectures as well. But for instance, to define life task for some people who say, well, what is that? Life task would be the aspect to be purified is sent out into a realm of consciousness that is commensurate with its own state. In other words, you're not sent out to be humiliated or defeated. You're set out into an environment commensurate with your own state, and an incarnation is chosen to fulfill specific tasks. When the inner being permeates the outer personality, the task will be fulfilled. So in other words, when you get it, you'll be done. Being done, however, does not mean that you disappear or die. There can be other tasks waiting for you. The incarnatory plan, life task, is not an absolute. It's not a single sheet of paper. Guide spends some time talking about the equivalent of there's plan A, plan B, plan Z, and I I tease and say, and plan double Q or double Z. Spirit is not unaware of a lot of possibilities that could happen during a lifetime, and they create the equivalent of a contract that on Earth would be 10,000 pages that would account for all the possibilities. In other words, your free will, how eager you are to learn, how open you are, how positive you are, how free of negativity you become, will all influence how your task is completed, to what degree it is completed. The other analogy that I use is that when I was a student, to get a C was a failing grade. I was not, my parents were not pleased at the idea of a grade of C. But there needs to be a place where you can make a D in a task, where you can be close to failure, but not quite. There needs to be a minimum standard. And very few people like minimum standards. They're below our expectations. The idea is that your life task does have a minimum standard, and it was designed that way for you to be able to meet it. To some degree, the way I interpret this is it's all good, because if your life plan was designed so that you could meet it, then you can exceed it. That with fairly little effort, you can do better than the minimum standards of your life task. There's a lack of awareness, and the guide says that it's because of our viewpoint from within a limited outer consciousness, that our personalities are fragments of who we are in spirit. We're bigger than this. But we bring in fragments because you don't want to bring in the whole being. That would make the task too easy. So that some talents are withheld, some abilities are withheld, and others are brought forward because they need to be developed. If you brought forward all of you, you could make things work without basically leaning on your weak leg. So the aspect of you that needs to be developed needs to be front and center. It needs to be out and forward. And so that its weakness or its lack of development becomes obvious over time. And this is where the difference between wanting to be happy and fulfilling a spiritual plan, these are not the same things. There is a lecture on happiness, and it talks about long-term spiritual happiness. This lecture talks about the fact that that may take 3, 4, 5 incarnations. And you may be in an incarnation that isn't designed to bring you a lot of pleasure, but it is designed to bring you development, and development will create happiness and pleasure. Think of it like running a marathon. Nobody's happy in the middle of a marathon. It's hard work. It pushes skeletal, muscular, nerve, systematic abilities to their absolute maximum. You make a decision to run a marathon, and you've got to accept that for a period of time during that marathon, you're just going to ache and hurt and want to quit. If you think of lifetimes like that, some of us are at that point in our marathon. And the reason for these lectures, for these materials, is to bring you hope, to bring you the message that there is a purpose to what is going on in your life, that you're not being punished through having a difficult life. There's another aspect to that. The guide talks about not judging and not evaluating other people or even yourself. You don't know the entire arc of this spirit's journey. You don't know where they are in the marathon. So that the snapshot you get, the segment that you see, is easy to misinterpret. So the guide suggests to have humility regarding judgments of ourselves and others, to be generous. This would correlate with the biblical phrase, judgment is for God alone, or judgment is mine, saith the Lord. And the meaning of that, the enlightened, if I may use that term, the enlightened meaning of that is that human beings don't have all the information they need to make a spiritual judgment on people. You can judge if someone is worth your time. You can judge if someone, if you want to have a second or third meeting, or if you want to take a job, or if you want to become friends or go into a relationship with someone. This you are perfectly capable of judging, but that's not really the word. It's making a decision. The word judgment in this case is about determining who they are, who you are, who has value, who is the superior. These are the judgments the guide is suggesting that you become humble about. And you simply see where you are and what you're dealing with, and accept that other people may be, if I may use this analogy a little bit longer, they may be at a different point in their marathon. So you may have more energy than they do, or you may have less. They may have more, and they may have less. But that each of us has a spiritual plan of development, and it will vary from lifetime to lifetime, from segment to segment. Just as many of you have experienced differences from one decade to another. There's a lot more in this lecture about preparing the incarnatory plan for the next phase of your development, and also about physical birth. It's a, I think the term is metaphysical lecture, in that it talks about processes, and the guide says he's doing the best he can to try to use human language and human abilities to relate to these processes to what happens in spirit, and that it's inferior. It's just the best he can do. So the lecture is a little bizarre sometimes, talking about fluid exchanges and mystical this and mystical that, talks about being in hospitals so that you are recuperating. And he keeps saying, but this is all an analogy. It's a way of describing it to you. I like the lecture in part because it makes me feel more confident. I can understand the process if I have some metaphors that are mechanical to deal with. If I understand this in terms of schooling, then I can understand the abstract nature of that, but I can relate it to my human experience of going through different experiences of schooling, where I have, for instance, in primary, you weren't allowed to choose your teachers or your classes, and then you got a few choices, and then you got to high school, and then you got to college, and sometimes you get out into life as an adult, and you can do anything you want, and you can make some terrible choices, and you accept the consequences, or you eventually must accept the consequences of those decisions. And I can understand this as above, so below, as a metaphor for my spiritual life. At one point, the guide says that some of us bite off more than we can chew, and I'm very aware of that downfall, that shortcoming, and that can create a very painful and difficult place in your life. And yet it's a learning process. In other words, there's a place where you need to learn to step back a few steps. I am infamous in my family for never wanting to go backtrack. I'll go way out of my way, but I hate to even reverse a block or two. This is a shortcoming. It's silly. It's reactionary. It's a misunderstanding of going forward and going back. Shortcoming of mine, but perhaps you can understand this as an analogy for sometimes we do have to take a few steps back, go sideways, or move forward very slowly because something is going on before we can move forward with more speed. Anyway, I love the lecture, so I decided to sneak it in on week 5 of this cycle. I hope you read the lecture, Pathwork Lecture 34, downloadable from the pathwork.org International Pathwork Foundation website, and the study guide is on mine. So thanks for listening and take care.